if we are aimlessly putting a version of ourselves out there based on what somebody else is telling us to do without introducing any of our individuality, well, every time you do that, you're moving away from your authentic personality, which then takes you one step closer to an identity crisis.
We're looking for the latest trending TikTok audio or the script that's going to help us get our sales. But there's two parts to this. It's like most of the coaches I know are struggling, know they should be doing outreach, but they're not doing it. A lot of these mentorships, while being great to give people a head start, very rarely teach people to break through and be standout. They teach people to get to $3,000 a month and get off the gym floor, but then what next?
And getting off the gym floor at $3,000 per month is the biggest challenge, right? Because one other thing which you hear tons being thrown around is that online coaching is saturated. Truth is, everything's saturated. Whatever market you go into, it's saturated.
So Dan, I've been really looking forward to this episode of the show. Like over the last, it's been 3-4 months, you've helped me hugely trying to piece together the chaoticness of moving from Hong Kong, looking to start a business, finding out my direction. And we're at the point now where things are still as chaotic, but I'm managing it better and going in the right direction. And the question I kind of wanted to ask you first is, like we said up there, anyone who gets into your line of work does so for a reason. So tell us a little bit about you and your story. Why have you become a mental performance coach?
That's a big question. Why have I become a mental performance coach? Well, I actually became a cognitive hypnotherapist and NLP practitioner before I became a mental performance coach. And if I trace that back and answer why I became a cognitive hypnotherapist and NLP practitioner, it's because I saw the benefits of it firsthand myself. So around 2020, I was 20K in debt. I was working in sales, successfully working in sales, doing pretty comfortable salary, nudging 6 figures. And I thought that everything was going well. I thought that I had a pretty fulfilling life, but it was around the same sort of time when lockdowns were being dropped here and there. And with every lockdown that took place, the lifestyle that I had built around that successful career was no longer possible. So I couldn't go out on a party, which was a form of escapism for me. So eventually it all culminated to a point whereby I had an identity crisis. That life which I built for myself didn't make sense anymore. And after a period of chasing my own tail and trying to figure out my own problems on my own, I finally raised my hand and asked for help in the form of therapy. And over the course of about 6 months, my personal therapist, Hugh Osborne, who specializes in addiction, because that's a big part of my history and background as well, helped me unpack all of the trauma and challenges that I'd experienced over the course of my life so that I could rebuild my identity and create somebody who I felt truly, authentically aligned with. And it was difficult, it was challenging, but arguably essential process for most people is confronting their trauma and stuff and rectifying it. So I saw the benefits of therapy firsthand, and it was such a profound transformation for me that I decided to train as a therapist myself, eventually resulting in becoming a mental performance coach at TMP, which is where our relationship initiated, but also building my own addiction therapy business, which I do about 20% of the time. So 80% of my time is spent inside TMP working with online coaches and entrepreneurs like yourself. And then 20% of my time is spent working with people who are like I used to be, essentially. So highly driven, ambitious, focused people who have dirty habit in the form of an addiction, predominantly drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex porn, the usual. That's what I work with outside of TMP. So that's a kind of snapshot overview of my background.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that. I think the first thing that caught my attention is you said you were pushing 6 figures in sales, but also 20 grand in debt. And this is something I can imagine there are a lot of coaches in this similar position. I have been a coach in this similar position. Like, why was that the case? Was it just a lifestyle creep? And before you give me, and I know you won't because I know you well enough now, but go a layer deeper into why you think you ended up in that position, spending obviously 20 grand at least more than what you were making.
Insecurity, in one word. Deeply rooted insecurity. And the thing that I spent my money on the most was partying. And interestingly, within that, I would go out with a group of people, often perceive them to be better than me in some way, shape, or form, usually looking at vanity metrics in sales like the leaderboard, right? You go into the sales office, there's a board, you can clearly see how you're performing against all of your colleagues. And if you looked at other people and they're doing better than you, naturally, I interpreted that as them being better people than me. And I wanted to win them over and connect with them on a more intimate level and kind of get validated by them. So I'd go out partying with them and I'd be spending money on drugs, as it was anyway, spending a lot of money on cocaine. And the money which I would spend on my credit cards and get myself into debt was by going out to lavish restaurants and bars and spending a lot of money on drinks. And part of that was just because it gave me dopamine. It made me feel good. But looking beneath the layers of that now, having gained a lot more emotional maturity, I can see that there was a part of me that just didn't feel enough. So by spending money on meals, drinks, events, etc., for myself and groups of people, it would make me feel like I was connected with them more deeply and therefore validated by them. So a lot of that money was spent on fueling insecurity in a way.
Do you think there's an element of having something to prove? Because I can really relate to this. I know for me, like, and we've spoken about this, like struggling to connect deeply with people has been a big issue that we've worked through. And I know for a lot of my early upbringing, certainly partying, and for me was sort of like, well, if I don't feel as interesting, I almost need to, whether this leveled the playing field, like you were saying, like it made you connect. But to me, it was almost a layer deeper than that. It was like, I still don't think I'm good enough. But if I go out on a Friday and Saturday night, it gives me more chance to kind of almost attain that holy grail. I will say something funny. I will do something funny. I will connect with something, which I'm not going to do sitting at home on a Saturday night.
Yeah, definitely. Well, my thing was always that I just didn't feel smart enough. And that actually came from a series of parent-teacher evenings whereby I received the words which many kids will have received as, he's got so much potential, but he just doesn't know what to do with it. I had that so many times, and that then caused me to form a belief at the core of my being of, I am just not smart, or I cannot do this. And I'd look to other people who were performing better than me and think, well, they must be doing something that's better than me. So inferiority complex is what I define that as, really.
Do you think, like, turning the tables here, we did a drill where I floated above my timeline and I looked back. Is in your timeline, is the school teacher, parent-teacher days the root of this? Or does this go back further?
It goes back further. So something which we haven't done yet, but something which I will do with a lot of one-to-one clients is mapping out critical events. So if I were to go back along my timeline and map critical events, first one is the fact that I'm adopted. So I was adopted at a very young age.
We have done it.
Yeah. We have, yeah. So first event for me was being adopted at a very young age. And although I had a really, really good upbringing from my adoptive parents, when I came to understand what it meant to be adopted, I interpreted that almost as abandonment, which then caused me to form a belief of I'm not good enough. So operating from a place of feeling different to everybody else and quite a lot of shame and sadness and just a sense of not belonging, that was in there. So that was point number one. Point number two was my adoptive mother dying when I was 18 years old. And this was at a point where I was kind of at the peak of using a lot of steroids. So my ego was soaring through the roof at this point, and she died. And because I wanted to maintain this kind of macho personality, didn't show any weakness at the funeral because some good friends of mine were there and I didn't want to appear weak in front of them. So packaged all the emotion up from that as well. So there's two events which I'm now kind of storing all of that energy for. From there, the lockdowns happen. I'm going through this period of identity crisis, which I've already described. And there was a return to work meeting, which I had with my boss at the time, after I'd gone through this process of like awakening and becoming aware of my life and the reality of my situation. And he said one thing to me which stuck with me ever since, and it cut through me and just shattered the layers of identity which I had at that point. And he said, prior to the lockdown and time away from the business, you were one person. Now you've returned as someone completely different. And I just don't know who Dan is anymore. And those words were like a hammer going to a mirror, you know, and it just shattered everything which I thought I knew about myself. Short term, horrific. Long term, best thing that could have ever happened. Because if I was going right, those words caused me to go left.
It's interesting in those situations, like one, like how much our psyche and how much our mind can affect some of the things we never think we could do. Like you mentioned, like being macho at your adopted mother's funeral, and I remember nowhere near the same thing, but I remember going to my partner's one of their grandparents' funeral, and it was the first. I was preparing for the first photo shoot I ever did, or the first one where I really took it seriously, and because I felt like I wasn't enough, and because I was so determined that I'm not going to be the biggest, so I'm going to be the leanest, I took my Tupperware to a funeral. I'm like, I look back at that and go, what was I doing? But my own insecurity meant that this was more important in my mind than the event and reading the room actually was. You know, and I think that's, but like, why do you think that like your brain was so engulfed in your struggles that you did that with regards to being macho at the funeral, but it was only one sentence. Like it was broken as easily as it was, tough to break in the first place. Why do you think that is?
I think that everybody has what I'll call an emotional threshold. So if you imagine a container, and within the container is energy in the form of emotion, we have all got a limited capacity for storing unprocessed emotion. And those events which I explained a moment ago, adoption, mother dying at 18, and then that event with my boss at the time, I didn't process any of those situations as and when they were going on. I experienced them. Cognitively, I understood what was going on, but somatically, emotionally, inside my body, no processing took place. So the energy which was generated as a result of those events was never actually in motion around my body. It was very stagnant. And I reached my threshold by the point my boss said those words to me. So all it took was a tiny little crack in the armor, and all of that just erupted. And you hear about people who go through their whole lives and then hit depression. My theory is that something very similar is happening there. People end up in a depression when their emotional threshold reaches capacity. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a groundbreaking, newsworthy event that causes depression to erupt. It can be something seemingly benign on the surface, because it's not about what happens. It's about what happens inside of us as a result of what happens, where the problems come from. And I had reached a point where there was just so much deeply buried, unprocessed emotion inside of me that it could have taken anything, honestly, to break me at that point. I knew that something wasn't right. I knew that I wasn't living in alignment with my authentic self. So, as I said, that was just a hammer in the armor, and it just cracked it all open.
Yeah. It's another thing that I can relate to. Like, I remember when I reached out to you guys at the back end of last year, I was almost going through another, I don't know whether I'd necessarily call it depression, but I felt almost a bit of almost a quarter life crisis. Like I always use the reference of Chris Williamson from Modern Wisdom, talking about the menopause. Everyone's bodybuilding in their 20s and then all of a sudden start doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in their 30s. But for me, like you said, the identity I built up kind of came tumbling down. And in a similar way, like I remember when my granddad passed away, and it was in between two group classes where I used to work. We had one at 1 to 125, then a 5-minute gap, and then 130 to 150. And in that 5-minute gap, I had like 12 missed calls from my dad. And I'm very, very close to my dad, but he's not the person who would just like call that many times. Rang up, found that my granddad died, and I had the choice. I could go home and someone would take the class and I could grieve that way, or I could go, right, I've got a class to run. It's not anyone else's fault. I've got to do it. And I did it. And I never really felt other than the actual funeral itself, like a proper grief from that. And whether it's trauma from how I perceive things where I used to work, whether that is what's happened, whether it's just a change in identity, being known as someone and having to almost reinvent myself. But there was nothing, there was no words like that. I was just at some point I was happy, relieved, crash. And it was not, it was almost like it was sudden, but didn't feel sudden. It was just like I don't feel right. And, it's almost then just kind of like trying to slowly sort of pick myself up, if that sort of makes sense. So I think you're right. It doesn't have to be anything. Just a change in state of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a major insight which came to me as a result of this process that I've been through. And that is, I think that I had a midlife crisis at age 23 because my theory is that when we say midlife crisis, like, this is a widely known phenomenon. Ask anyone, they'll be able to tell you what a midlife crisis is. But in my opinion, a midlife crisis is actually just an identity crisis. It's, I don't like the character that I'm playing anymore, so I'm going to check out of this one and rebuild myself. Because what you do often find with people who describe having had an identity crisis or midlife crisis is that the identity they build after that is really authentic. And they feel fulfilled because they go, well, I'm not going to live to anybody else's standards anymore. I'm going to do the things that I've always wanted to do but haven't felt safe to pursue. Yeah. It's always better on the other side. It's interesting. You hear midlife crisis all the time, but within that, what actually is it? I think it's an identity crisis.
So I want to sort of double back a little bit to the adoption thing, but I want to ask a question first because you kind of segued onto it nicely. As you said, people that go through this identity crisis live on their own terms. How can we help people? Like coaches, doesn't have to be coaches. Anyone struggles to take calculated risks. I know I have struggled to take those calculated risks in my life so many times. How do we get people being more comfortable with the uncomfortable so they can take those chances? They can maybe avoid the identity crisis or break through when it happens.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all approach to it, particularly in the coaching realm, because a lot of coaches are part of mentorships, right? And they're great. Mentorships offer a hell of a lot for coaches, but I think that it's important for coaches to take what they can from mentors, but not forget that they are their own unique individual person. We're all building online businesses and we need to build an online presence. But if we are aimlessly putting a version of ourselves out there based on what somebody else is telling us to do without introducing any of our individuality, well, every time you do that, you're moving away from your authentic personality, which then takes you one step closer to an identity crisis.
Yeah.
Does that make sense how I've explained that?
100% that makes sense. And you see it all the time. Like I put a post about it today, literally the video posted before this, about like coaches playing the long game. And it's exactly that. It's that we're looking for the latest trending TikTok audio or the script that's going to help us get our sales. But there's two parts to this. It's like most of the coaches I know are struggling, know they should be doing outreach, but they're not doing it. So the right script isn't going to be the answer. And also a lot of coaches aren't thinking, well, who's the coach you want to be in 5-10 years? Most people look up to your TMPs, your Mark Coles, your Jordan Shallows, insert coach here. None of them are doing this stuff. They are found their niche, they've invested in themselves, and they become a very, very good version of what they do. And I think with a lot of these mentorships, while being great to give people a head start, very rarely teach people to break through and be standout. They teach people to get to $3,000 a month and get off the gym floor, but then what next?
Yeah, absolutely. And getting off the gym floor at $3,000 per month is the biggest challenge, right? Because one other thing which you hear tons being thrown around is that online coaching is saturated. Truth is, everything's saturated. Whatever market you go into, it's saturated. But the way you get out of that is to become outstanding, because the area of the market which is saturated is the area of the market where people are average. And in order to break free from that, you need to become outstanding. How do you become outstanding? Well, you get to know yourself on the deepest possible level that you can, because then you can demonstrate parts of your personality which nobody else has got, because we are all completely unique individuals. The way to break through that $3,000 per month glass ceiling for anybody who's listening who is there is to get to know yourself and then demonstrate those parts of yourself in an authoritative and authentic way. But that's what a lot of people find quite challenging, because in order to do that, to be authentic, it's inherently vulnerable because you're exposing yourself. And that's hard. It's difficult. It's a lot easier to just follow a script or do what somebody else is doing, because you don't have to expose any parts of yourself there. You can just hide away from it in a way by doing the easy route, but you're kind of blocking yourself up massively by doing that.
It's also when you do break through that, you realize very quickly, like, what was I wasting my time for, worried about being vulnerable? Because that's often the stuff that ends up getting the most traction. Like we said, like a couple of things I think about. We said it before I came on air about the mentorship that I'm now running, and more people coming and asking me about it, and the difference. It's like, this is, I think, it's a surprise a lot of coaches, and often gets that little bit of identity crisis. Some people rush onto the online world. They've never spent an hour on the gym floor, so you haven't learned how to be good. But then you also get the coaches that have become pretty good on the gym floor. They can get a result with almost everybody. But the problem is, it's a different ball game where you now have to try and speak to those people on Instagram. So you become like, I can get everyone in shape, but then no one comes to you despite showing all the results on the social proof. And it's because I always use the analogy of like, if I was in my old job and I was given Susie from Slough, I would get her in shape. But I can't speak to Susie from Slough's pain points or her problems. And then you get coaches almost like coming ready for the online world, ready to start the business and take over. I'm like, I have no one. Like, there is no one coming in. Am I even as good as I think I am? And it's just because they haven't actually been either found their authentic self or actually worked out, well, who can I actually speak to? That sounds overly niche-y, but that was a game changer for me when I reverted back to what I know I can do.
Yeah. It's the story that we tell ourselves, which is the problem, not the outcome. Because fear of rejection, fear of judgment is massive. It comes up all the time, particularly in the coaches that I work with who are quite early in their journey. Don't want to go into that vulnerability because they're afraid of what other people will think. But that's purely a story. It's a narrative that's being told because you don't even know what people are going to think, particularly operating online. You could put something out there and somebody could judge you, which they probably will, but you're never going to know about it. So the problem is the story that you're telling yourself, not the actual outcome itself.
Yeah. And as I said earlier on, like, I recently, first podcast with new teeth, that post I put up showing my biggest insecurity is one of my most liked posts ever on Instagram. It's definitely almost commented. And other than maybe getting engaged. So, like, it's that personal, vulnerable stuff that often gets the most traction, the most eyes, the most breakthroughs that a lot of coaches are actually scared to put out there and make. And I think, certainly you're saying that with new coaches. I remember when I came out of running education for one of the biggest gyms in the world, and I decided to just go into the generic, I'll help busy people who haven't got time to go to the gym get in shape. And I struggled with it because it wasn't authentic to what I wanted to do, and I was taking the easy road out. And it was only when I stopped and I was like, I got the imposter to compare myself to these bigger names in the education space. And I went, well, I'm friends with half of these people. I've got phone numbers of half of these people. They're not competition. They are people that can help me get to where they are. And when I had that, I can't remember what happened. I think it was chatting to Michael Gould, and he went, hey, if you want to just have a coffee and chat mentorships, I'm happy to help. And I'm like, that all of a sudden I was like, this isn't competition. He will help me. There's plenty of coaches out there that are, to go around and create business. And all of a sudden that was that for you, that breaking point earlier on. Then for me, this is the big breakthrough moment. Like, oh, hold on, why am I not doing this? The only way I get to be like one of these people is to start.
Yeah, interesting. It's the same for me. My highest performing post is one where I was talking about my steroid use back in the day. And I think for me, possibly for you as well, I mean, insecurity, like you used the term there, is a broad thing, and everybody's got insecurities, whether you want to admit it or not. We've all got insecurities. Insecurity is what drove me into steroid use and addiction. But the reason vulnerability does so well is because people resonate with it. They go, oh, I'm not alone. And the more you can make people feel like they're not alone, the more you're going to connect with them.
Yeah.
That's the paradox.
So tell me a little bit about the highs and lows of using steroids? Like, what we kind of maybe touched on it already, but why did you decide to go down that path? And what was that journey like?
It's an interesting one because when I first took them, I was 17, super young, working in recruitment at the time, very fresh into sales, wanted to prove myself. There was a guy there who I looked up to who encouraged me to try Anavar. So started in quite a low-level steroid, although it's still a steroid, right? It's still changing your anatomy in some way, shape, or form. So I started taking Anavar, and I honestly didn't understand it. I didn't know what I was getting myself in for. I didn't do any research. I had recently started taking creatine, and if I reflect back on it now, at the time, I didn't really know whether there was any difference between what I was taking in Anavar and creatine. I thought it was just another kind of over-the-counter supplement I'm taking here. Obviously, it wasn't, because a couple of months down the line, I saw pretty serious gains from it, and obviously wanted more. But I started at a point where when I was 17, that I'd absolutely not maximized my natural potential at that point. In fact, I'd probably only been consistently training for about a year. So it was way too early to be considering something like this. And I didn't know any of the health precautions, which I should have been aware of, but I went into it anyway. And naturally, after a short amount of time of seeing some positive results from Anavar, moved on to testosterone, and then things really leveled up from there and started seeing some real strong results from it. And I think that is the point where it really became a matter of ego. That's where I was starting to get the real confidence boost. My energy was up. I was quite lean. I was quite strong, and I felt empowered as a result of it. And because I'm prone to addiction, and when I find something which I enjoy, I want more of it, I leveled up. And from testosterone, found Trenbolone. From there, did a cut with Clen and T3. Everything which I could get my hands on, I just did. And as has been a historical repetition in many different behaviors that I've done in the past, it resulted in catastrophe. So I'd say I was on and off test and tren cycles for about 4 years until I started to produce fat in the glands of my breast. So I got gynecomastia. And it wasn't that bad, but it was bad enough to make me feel really insecure in any t-shirt which wasn't black, because the sun would catch it and I'd be quite self-conscious of it. Now, because it wasn't that severe and it was self-induced, I went to the NHS and asked them if I could get surgery for it, and they said no, it's not something that we could do here. So I had surgery for the gynecomastia by working with a clinic in Poland, because it was a lot cheaper than the Harley Street clinics which I visited and was quoted for. So I went there and had surgery for gynecomastia. So I can't possibly get gynecomastia anymore. And at the time I saw that as an opportunity to do another steroid cycle. So I didn't learn from it. I came back from Poland. This is at about age 21, there or thereabouts. And I did another steroid cycle. A series of cycles actually on and off for about 2 to 3 years, until I pushed it so hard that I don't know whether this is true, but I think I had a steroid-induced depression which came to me, because it was just doing so much with my hormones. And admittedly, I was working in a job which I really didn't enjoy at the time. Quite a difficult manager was micromanaging me, but it resulted in depression. And that was the real point where I realized that I had to stop dabbling in this kind of stuff. But it was a real emotional roller coaster, ultimately fueled by ego. Hope that answers your question.
100%. And do you think this is an element of, again, you feeling that you weren't enough, like being the big guy in the room would make up if you didn't feel like the smartest guy in the room? Was this a little bit of what fueled this?
Absolutely, yeah. All of the destructive behaviors that I did, whether it was taking cocaine, smoking weed, vaping, porn addiction at one point, steroid use, it all stems from the same place, as do most destructive behaviors. It'll always come from a kind of core wound, series of core wounds, or a limiting belief that we're operating from, like I'm not enough, I don't belong, I'm not smart enough in my case. We'll consciously go out of our way to find reasons to counteract that. And it's often an unconscious process that we do that, like it was for me, until you reach a breaking point, whether that's an identity crisis or depression or crippling anxiety. Usually there'll be something which serves as a brick wall, as a breaking point, which is then an opportunity to look in the mirror and go, I'm doing this for all the wrong reasons here. This is madness. And then it's a case of doing that deeper inner work to try and figure out where it's coming from. But it's not always obvious. It's not always obvious. It's easy for me to say that now, and other people might recognize similar behavioral traits in themselves, but often we form layers and layers and layers of protection around our challenges, like those beliefs, like those emotions, the trauma that we hold on to. We'll form layers and layers of stuff around that. So we'll just go about our lives, as many people do, go about their lives destructively, unconsciously. So they don't really know that they're doing anything wrong until they hit that breaking point, because they've got so many layers of protection between them and whatever the energetic charge is that's driving them towards those behaviors in the first place.
So if there's somebody listening to this, coach or anyone, right, that may, as you said, they resonated with some of the stuff that you've gone through, and maybe they're in a financial position where they can't invest in TMP or any therapy, like how does somebody start to break down those layers?
Having honest conversations with not only themselves, but with the people around them who they may recognize as being contributors to whatever the destructive behavior is. Because having the capability to go and do the deep work is great, but I totally appreciate what you're saying. Not everybody's going to have that ability. So the one thing that anyone can do is make the unconscious conscious. And there are a number of different ways of doing that. One, which I've just explained there, is just talking. Emotion is often carried through vibration. So speaking about whatever it is, making the unconscious conscious. And then something which we've done some work on together is journaling, just brain dumping, understanding what is going on, because we'll often feel quite overwhelmed and stressed out and anxious and don't really know what to do with it. I know that I certainly didn't. When I was experiencing discomfort years ago, I didn't know how to process that stuff. So for anybody who's listening who doesn't have the capability of doing therapy, mindset work, whatever it is, do your thinking on paper. Write down what's being experienced. Understand what the feeling is, because the more we can put boxes around things, the easier it is to identify them in the future. And beyond that, the more likely we are to be able to control it and manage it, because a lot of people are almost passengers in their own body a lot of the time, hence why they're driven towards difficult emotions. Put your hands back on the wheel by understanding what you're feeling. And that'll be uncomfortable at first, because you have to surrender to the feeling before you're able to identify it. But journaling will help you do that, because what you're doing there is making something which is intangible, i.e. a thought or emotion, tangible. It's something that you can see, makes it almost material. And as we've done in a lot of the deeper work that we've done together, when you're able to put boxes around things, you can use them to your advantage rather than them having used you.
100%. I think if there is, and I'll say this now, if there is any coach that's like, not like the people we spoke about before, who can't afford this in any stretch of imagination, but on the fence going, is this a worthwhile investment? Is 100%. Yeah. I was that person back in the last year. Like, I couldn't really afford, right, jumping on board with you guys. But the work we've done, the clarity I've got has made that money back tenfold. And it's indirect. Like, you've not taught me how to make sales. But you've just refined my product, refined my pitch, refined my confidence, and refined my message. That has generated opportunity, even if it wasn't instant, 6-7 months down the line. And I feel we'll continue to, moving on to my next venture when I sort of move away. Like, doubling back a little bit, like you obviously said a lot of this stuff is layers, and you experienced being adopted at an early age, right? And interesting with all the people you work with, right? You have a story from adoption. I'm sure you've worked with other people that have. And you'll have worked with people that have many siblings and people like me who are only children. Do you feel, and obviously this is obviously very case-by-case basis, but do you feel there are different things that crop up in people with different family dynamics? Like, Is there things that only children tend to struggle with more so than people who are adopted or people who have loads of big families?
That's a really interesting question. Early childhood is where the vast majority of people's problems in the present day will be originating from. So the same problems can come from different family dynamics. I'll explain what I mean by that. If you've got a family which has got 5 siblings within it, naturally, each one of those siblings will probably be having similar thoughts insofar as, why do they get more than me? Why don't I have the same opportunities to go and hang out with friends as they do, etc.? This kind of stuff, right? So that's a dynamic which will form in a larger family, which will probably form a belief of, I'm not as good as them, they're better than I am, I don't deserve X, this kind of stuff, right?
Could you also flip that? Could you also flip that in the sense as well that sometimes I feel missing out? The only thing I feel I'm missing out on having a siblings is that maybe they could have made me more adept at social communication, so I didn't get the opportunities and the feedback that I got when I was young of being rejected from friendship groups, because I had more practice at being a social being because I've grown up with people. You know, like, can that swing both ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything can happen. And we're almost conditioned to believe that we live in an either or universe. It must be this or that. When we're talking about emotion, anything's possible because we are so complex as human beings. Complex beyond belief. We don't understand the human brain yet. So when you say, could this be possible? Yeah, absolutely. It could be. It certainly could be. And it makes sense in your case. If you're an only child and you were looking to other families, perhaps, was it a case that you were feeling that you were almost inferior to them in some way because you didn't have that practicing capability?
I don't think it directly, but I certainly feel like maybe like the little unspoken things about communications, like we've spoken about before, like a lot of stuff that we've worked in, right? It's like not necessarily being able to hold on to a lot of friendships and things like this. And it's not like I'm an all right conversationalist. I can do all this stuff. Like on paper, there should be no struggle. But these little things I can't quite put my finger on. And I wonder sometimes that's the things you learn from a brother and a sister, or just having people close your age from an early aspect, rather than me with my parents. The only time I hang out with people of a similar age was when we went out. I was very tight-knit to my parents a lot of the time, except when I went and played rugby.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, this doesn't necessarily relate to you, but what I would say on that is because there are a lot of similarities that people could draw on this, right? We'll often look for reasons why we are the way we are, but the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about childhood and early foundational experiences which ultimately contribute to who we are today, it couldn't have been any other way. Because it wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing to come to terms with for a lot of people. And sometimes if somebody's kind of desperately trying to figure something out, having an insight like that can be the difference between letting it go and keeping it going in terms of that never-ending puzzle, because sometimes there's just no way of figuring things out. Often we can do deeper work and there's always going to be some kind of event which is pinned to a belief, right? As we've done timeline processes together, we kind of start as a belief with our anchor point, we follow that back, see wherever it originated from, and often we can just release it there and then. But other times we'll have puzzles that will be running around in our head, and it's actually us who's creating the puzzle. So sometimes just understanding that some puzzles aren't going to be figured out, and that's okay. Accepting that not everything is going to be solvable is okay. Often we will be able to figure them out, but sometimes it's a product of our own creation, and understanding that can be the difference between moving forward and letting go.
And figuring something out doesn't necessarily mean that there's a resolution moving forward, right? I think that what you said there was quite liberating, in the sense of, well, I can't change my childhood. I can't change how many siblings I have. So what impact does it have if I find, oh, that's the root of my problem. Oh, the only child led me to this, this, and this. Great. What am I going to do about it? Because I am in this position now. Knowing that doesn't do me any good. how does it impact what I do moving forward is the much bigger thing. And I think that's often where people miss on.
Yeah. So, absolutely.
I want to go into, obviously, with a little bit of time we have left.
Yeah.
There's a conversation I thought was really, really interesting here. Like, I've had guys in your line of work, a few people on, and we've talked about. There's a number of questions here that we haven't got to: imposter syndrome and procrastination and stuff that I'm sure you have amazing insight on. But it's something there's a dime a dozen in terms of podcasts. But I want to talk on the topic of ADHD. And I spoke with Kieran about ADHD more in the direct terms of what can someone do who's struggling with it. I was newer with my diagnosis. But for me, I generally, and again, I'm sure many people think this, I generally think I have this condition based on the fact that I've looked back in childhood and there's a lot of things that reoccur. What I've seen is more and more of my friends that I would have never gone, yeah. And now coming to me and go, oh, look, I got this too. And I'm medicated for it. And you're seeing more and more of these diagnoses. And I wanted to get your take. Do you think there's actually a rise in the cases of diagnosed ADHD, maybe because we know more and people were just not diagnosed as children? Or do you think we're now in a world that has more distractions than ever before and people have less ability to delay gratification because Deliveroo and Netflix means everything's instantaneous, are giving more people ADHD-like symptoms without actually having ADHD because the diagnosis in itself is a questionnaire. It's subjective. So what do you think? This is almost a chicken and the egg question. Is there generally a rise, or is our environment creating that illusion?
I think it's the latter, personally. I think that technology has advanced at such an astounding rate over very recent years that the natural evolution of human neurology and psychology, which was already taking the place, has just been accelerated dramatically insofar as our attention span is the shortest it's ever been. All you've got to do is look at the type of media that we consume, whether that's on social media itself or on television. Next time you're watching television, pay attention to how quickly the screen rate changes. Every 3 to 4 seconds, there's a new scene. And that's because it's doing the same thing as what you see on social media. Constantly changing. It keeps us interested. We're simple and very complex at the same time. In terms of what gives us feel-good chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, quick, new, novel things. That's why things are changing so often. So naturally, over the time, our neurology is going to change to adapt to that. So ADHD is a fairly recent phenomenon, right? It's something that we put a box around quite recently. Said, this type of person is this way. And if you go back 10 years, 15 years, that was quite a unique thing. It's just not now. I think that it's actually quite a fashionable thing to have. This is my opinion. I think a lot of people like to say that they've got ADHD. It's a big topic of conversation nowadays. And for those people who look to ADHD and they're thinking, oh, maybe I've got that. Maybe you do. But what difference does that make? What are you going to do with it is the main question. Because just putting yourself into the box of ADHD is one thing, but understanding what that actually means by way of your neurology, your ability to focus, your ability to hit flow state and get shit done, that's what's more important. So I think that people need to stop hyperfixating on what ADHD is and instead turn their attention and focus to who they are and what it means for them. Just putting yourself into a box is not going to get you anywhere. In fact, I know a lot of people who have gone deep down the rabbit hole of ADHD and it's actually caused them more stress than not doing it because they're just hyperfixated on understanding whether they have it or not. It doesn't matter. Getting a diagnosis is useful if you're going to pursue the avenue of medication. Now, that's a very complex and multifaceted area to explore, which I'm not qualified to do. I cannot prescribe medication. Most people don't need to go down that route. They're just easily distractible. I am. I get easily distracted when I'm bored. How do you combat that? You do tasks that you enjoy, you outsource the rest. I know not everybody's going to be able to do that. I appreciate that costs money, but a lot of people just want to say that they've got ADHD more than they do understand who they are as a person, how they work, and what they can do to optimize for their own physiology and neurology.
Yeah.
That's my piece of it.
I 100% agree with this, despite being a person that has had a diagnosis, just over a year ago. It's it's one of those things where I think we've lost the ability to delay gratification. We've lost the skill, and it is a skill. Like I'm reading a book at the moment called Indistractable, and again, it's hard because I don't read very much. Right, I've always struggled, and while again, even myself, who I can look back at times as a toddler and go, I can see the wiring, but I got the diagnosis as more of like, okay, this is the answer to the coming full circle. The parent-teacher meetings where I got the potential but really distractible, as opposed to people who've struggled in the last couple of years and now got an ADHD diagnosis. But I went in, I got that diagnosis, and I was like, right, what am I going to do? And in that book that I was saying about, it's like a lot of people say, you get a text message. Let's say I got a text message now and I got this urge to reply to it. It's like, I'm not going to reply to that for 5 minutes. And like a gym session, it's a progressive overload. I reply to that message in 5 minutes. Next time, 10 minutes. Next time, 15 minutes. And just learning that skill and planning time in for deep work, planned worry is something I've tried to do. If something's on my mind that worries me, I'm going to think of that later. Rather than just trying to ignore it and hope it goes away, that's the time where I'm going to worry about that stuff. And it's just that skill set that we just don't have anymore. And I worry about it because you talked about social media and the jump cuts, and some of it is just unbelievable. I still am a fan of listening to a 3-hour episode of Joe Rogan. Yeah, I get distracted and I pull out my phone and I'm working on that. But like, I see things now where there are so many jump cuts and so many animation that need to pop on. Like, if you can't get 15 seconds, that is not an ADHD problem. That is a skill problem of being able to hold your attention on something. And that's a practice, in my 2 cents. ADHD or not.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. One thing which is an absolute game changer for me was just turning all notifications off, part one, but then removing all visual signs of notifications on your home screen. Like, I have email and that's it at this point, I remember like previously I'd have tons of ones jumping up on there or more notifications. And something that I forget who it was who said it now, but attention is the currency of the digital economy. And when you've got numbers flashing up at you constantly with color, which again, humans, we're simple. We see color, we click it, we like that. If you've got that flagging you all the time, your attention's going. You don't own that attention anymore. Give yourself that attention back by turning everything off. There are some things which you might need to be needing to be plugged into, but there are ways around this, like setting time blocks out, structuring to give yourself dedicated time to check things rather than be constantly dipping in and out of everything, losing your attention to it. You're not really getting that much done. You're spreading yourself very thin.
And that is something that I am certainly very guilty of. And one of the big things, like the first thing I'm going to do when I move back is create that structure, because I can go from one end of the spectrum to the other. I can very much go from being cluttered, because one-to-one PT kind of forces a chaotic structure. You can try your best to kind of rein it in, but you're at the beck and call of everyone else's diaries. And now I go back and I can easily go to, I'll just do it when I like because I've got all day. And like, no, I'm going to use this time and get things done earlier and plug these things in and get that structure in place. Otherwise, I know in 6 months I'm going to regret it. So before I go into where can people find you, which is obviously a very important part of this, there's a common question, which I'm really intrigued to your answer, that I've asked almost every guest for like the last 50 episodes. And it tends to floor people because it's a big question, but I kind of like that. So don't worry if you need to pause and think about it. Name me one thing that you have changed your mind about. Whilst you think of an answer, I'll see, like, the reason why I love this question and I end every show with it is because I like the idea that people think that the people they look up to know all the answers. And we don't. And this is why I want everyone, no matter how big, how many followers you have, to realize that you will change your mind on things, you'll be wrong, you'll make mistakes.
Yeah, I really like that question, by the way. So great work on that. Simple yet profoundly effective. One thing that I have changed my mind about more than anything is recognizing that belief is going to come nowhere other than from yourself. I say that because I used to look outside of myself to get validation and confidence, as I've explained, through going out, drinking, partying, etc. making the realization that I was never going to get that from them, and it was only going to come from myself, was the biggest thing I've ever changed my mind about.
That's an incredible answer. So for anyone who wants to learn more about you, or even sign up with TMP and work with you, or the staff that you're now building around you, where can people find you?
Instagram is where I hang out with Total Mental Performance. So really simple, just at Dan_TMP. And the main Instagram account for Total Mental Performance is just at Total Mental Performance.
And I will second this and give a big shout out. I think this is an absolute game-changing no-brainer. I think when I signed up, I had a therapist here that I have a lot of people that really like, but a lot of times, and he's great. I'm not, if he unlikely listens to this, I'm not going to shout out to him, but just that ability to be able to connect the dots and understand where I'm coming from, people work with coaches and understand the struggles that we face, and can actually help me not just get over the struggles, but actually start to put things into place to actually perform well, hence mental performance rather than therapy. You know, I understand that term wholeheartedly more than I did 6 months ago. So I would like, thank you, thank Kieran. It's been huge. And if someone's on the fence, listen to this. After listening to the Kieran episode, listen to Dan's episode now, just jump on a call. You will not regret it.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
No worries, man. Thank you for coming on the show.
Awesome.